This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 282nd episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. My historical superhero work in progress, Wayfarer, is the first book on which I've used the writing software Scrivener right from the start. And I have to say, I am loving it. There are so many great little functions, but my favorite by far is the simplicity of having all my working files, draft, research notes, character notes, setting pictures, deleted data, all in one place where I can set them up on the screen in a variety of ways to maximize their accessibility. I will be doing a post soon on the specifics of how I've integrated Scrivener into my writing process. In April, I'll also be hosting another of the insanely popular free Scrivener webinars I did last year with Scrivener coach Joseph Michael. More news on that when the time gets closer. For now, you can find more info on Joseph's Learn Scrivener Fast course, which I highly recommend, and the free Scrivener templates I offer based on my books outlining your novel and structuring your novel on my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/resources. The latest post in the video series on my blog is Think You Wrote a Great Hook for Your Book's Beginning? Find out why it may not be enough. It talks about one of the most common misconceptions about a great hook for your book's beginning, and it shows you how to take grabbing your readers to the next level. To find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now, I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled Do You Know? These 6 must-have elements of a wow story premise. Story premise is the foundation of all good books. It's the fundamental kernel of the beginning idea. But it's more than that. If you can craft a solid story premise right from the beginning of your writing process, you will be able to capture all the concrete details necessary to bring your story to life. As most of you probably know, I am a tremendous advocate of outlines. And as such, the premise is always my starting point for creating a full-fledged outline of every story I write. But even if you're the freewheeling sort who prefers not to create detailed outlines before writing the first draft, a solid story premise can offer you a mini outline capable of guiding and informing everything you write. This is why you should always go that extra mile with your premise. If you settle for vague cliches in your story premise, you'll inevitably end up with a vague and cliched story. Before you ever sit down to write your opening line, take a moment to identify the 6 elements required by any premise, and take another moment to figure out how to make those elements so entirely awesome they take your breath away. Story premise element number 1, protagonist. Every story starts with character, and not just any character, but the character. Who is the hero of your story? Whose emotional and physical journey are you going to be following? Who's the most at stake? Whom do you find the most interesting? Who inspired the plot? Or, if the plot idea came first, who will be most suited to taking full advantage of its possibilities? Story premise element number 2, situation. Situation is the first kernel of your plot. This is the status quo in which your protagonist finds himself in the beginning of the story. How will your story start? What is the hero's personal condition at the beginning? And how will that condition be changed, for better or worse, by the hero himself or by the antagonistic force? Story premise element number 3, objective. A protagonist has no business showing up on the page without an objective. If he doesn't want something and want it badly enough to do just about anything to achieve it over the next couple hundred pages, then he doesn't deserve to have a story told about him. At the beginning of your story, what does the hero want? What moral or immoral choice is he going to have to make in an attempt to gain that objective? Story premise element number 4, opponent. Even an awesome character with a passionate goal isn't enough to drive a story. For that, you need conflict, and before you can even consider conflict, you have to create an antagonistic force that can stand in the way of your protagonist's objective. So who is your story's opponent? How is this person or entity standing in the way of the hero achieving his objective? What is the opponent's goal? What is his relationship to the protagonist? Story premise element number 5, disaster. The first quarter of your story will allow you to set up your characters and their world, but something dramatic has to happen at the first plot point to force them into action. Usually, this moment will be a comparatively disastrous one that destroys your protagonist's normal world or estranges him from it. What will be the disaster? How will it be the result of the protagonist's attempts to achieve his objective up to this point? How will the protagonist respond? How will the antagonistic force respond? Story premise element number 6, conflict. All of a sudden, you almost have yourself a story. All that remains is to see where your character's reactions to the disaster in the first plot point lead them. What's the story's main conflict? How is it a result of the hero's reaction to the disaster? How will it pit the protagonist and the antagonistic force at cross purposes? What is the logical flow of cause and effect that will allow this conflict to continue throughout the story? Now that you've gained a better idea of the possibilities for your story, you're ready to write your premise. In 2 sentences, you're going to produce a premise similar to these. Orphan gypsy Heathcliff, protagonist, grows up to love, that's the objective, his adopted sister Kathy, which is the situation. But when Kathy, who is the opponent, marries her wealthy neighbor, disaster, Heathcliff sets in motion a terrible vengeance that will pit him against everyone he knows. And there you have the conflict. That, of course, is from Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Or you also can have this kind of example. Restless farm boy, that's the situation, Luke Skywalker, protagonist, wants nothing more than to leave home and become a starfighter pilot so he can live up to his mysterious father. That's his objective. But when his aunt and uncle are murdered, disaster, after purchasing renegade droids, Luke must free the droids' beautiful owner and discover a way to stop, that's the conflict, the evil empire, that's the opponent, and its apocalyptic Death Star. That, of course, is Star Wars, A New Hope, directed by George Lucas. And just like that, you have a solid story premise on which to base your entire book. If you find yourself struggling to construct the actual sentences, take a second look at your original answers. Could any of them be strengthened to be more specific or original? A good story premise is worth spending some serious time on. In the end, you will have emerged possibly having identified and eliminated structural weaknesses, and definitely having created a valuable tool for outlining and pitching your novel. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.